Dr. Ali, firstly, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time out and coming to see me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I know you are extremely busy with all your work and your research and stuff that you do, but you've made some time to come and see me, so I'm really grateful for that. Firstly, I would like you to make a short introduction as to who you are and what it is that you do.
Thank you very much. No, it's an absolute pleasure to join you. So, as you mentioned, I'm a reproductive endocrinologist. So obviously I deal with hormones and predominantly focused on hormones that are to do with reproductive health and fertility. So I've done a fair amount of research over the last sort of decade or so around different reproductive hormones, reproductive conditions, so things like polycystic ovarian syndrome, another condition called functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, where you don't have sufficient energy for fertility. Also done some work around pregnancy and also genetic causes of infertility and things like that. A lot of my work has been around a particular neuropeptide that's been discovered it was first discovered in 96, but in terms of reproductive function in 2004, and that one's called Kisspeptin. So in the past, we thought that part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which controls lots of the hormones in the body, and a part of that called GnRH, gonadotrophin releasing hormone, we thought that was the highest level that controls all the hormones in the body. However, we now know that Kisspeptin acts even above that. So Kisspeptin now regulates GnRH and then the rest of the hormones in the body with respect to reproductive hormones.
Wow. Can you share with us what inspired you to specialize in reproductive endocrinology and what your early experiences or observations that motivated you to focus on hormone-driven fertility research?
So I've always been really interested in endocrinology. It's a really interesting specialty. So it's all about all of the hormones are in sort of cascades. There's usually a hormone that controls another hormone that controls another hormone, and they're all in sort of delicate balance. So what we call homeostasis. So they all feed back on each other. So if you, for example, GnRH, so the hormone that I was talking about from the hypothalamus, that will control the pituitary gland to make another two hormones, which might be a bit more familiar, FSH and LH. So FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, LH for luteinizing hormone, and they basically then act on the ovaries to stimulate production of eggs and also estrogen and progesterone and things like that. And what's really, they're all in a delicate balance. So if you have too much estrogen, that will then feed back to the top of the axis and say you need to make less. If you have too little, the opposite will happen, and your pituitary gland will start to make lots of FSH and LH. So there's mechanistically, it's very, very interesting. There's a lot of feedback loops, a lot of really interesting interpretation, and you can sort of, if you understand the kind of mechanisms by which it will work, you can sort of figure out what happens in a lot of conditions. So, for example, in polycystic ovary syndrome, we know you have high LH. If you know what LH does, it then acts in the ovary to make too much testosterone. And so then you can sort of figure out a lot of stuff from just a very small amount of knowledge, rather than sort of learning reams and reams of what happens in different things. So yes, so it's a specialty that's very much based around understanding physiology and how the normal human body works. And so that's one reason. So it's really intellectually interesting. But of course, the main reason is you want to be able to help patients with conditions that affect fertility and reproductive health. So obviously that's the kind of main driver. And also the fact that I think there's lots of work to be done in those areas. So, for example, yeah, we know that women's health generally is under-researched, and treatment can be improved. And actually, the government recognised that, and they put together what's called a call to action statement called the women's health strategy. So a couple of years ago, they published that, and trying to say that we need to prioritize research in women's health, and really put a focus on that, try and improve
I
care.
agree.
Yeah.
I agree. And whilst we're on this subject, reproductive health inequalities at the moment persist for many underserved groups. I'm from an underserved group. So, how can insights from endocrinology be translated into accessible care for education or communities facing barriers to fertility services?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really difficult for fertility services. So I think that the main problem is, for example, IVF treatments, which is obviously the sort of most definitive treatment for infertility, is very expensive. So when, from a sort of government point of view, they have to decide how much they can afford to spend on fertility as opposed to other things. But I think it does cause a lot of problems. So, for example, NICE, which is the sort of body that decides, is it cost effective to recommend IVF treatment or not? Do you benefit more than what you spend on IVF treatment? And the clear answer is yes. So they recommend you should have at least 3 cycles of IVF to have a good chance of conceiving and actually having a baby. However, around the country, that's not fully implemented. So depending on where you live, you might not have access to the full 3 cycles. Okay, because it's not. So local bodies will make decisions about that kind of thing. And so that makes it difficult, because then a large portion of people, if they've had their NHS cycle, for example, and unfortunately they didn't have a baby already, they often have to try and find the funds to go privately if they wish to do so. And that's obviously does cause a lot of inequity, because it's very expensive, as you can imagine, and there's no guarantee that the next cycle will work. So you might need more than 1 cycle. Generally, it's about a third, slightly more than a third, in good prognosis patients to have a baby after each cycle. So usually after 2 or 3 cycles, most people are sort of having a decent chance of conceiving. But of course, not everybody. And obviously, the more cycles you have, the more expensive it is. And not everybody can obviously afford to have multiple cycles. And it's not just the cost, it's obviously an emotional burden. You put your hope into this cycle being successful, and then if it isn't, it's very difficult. And obviously not everyone can keep going through the process over and over. So it does involve lots of injections and scans and, hope and stress. And then obviously if things don't work out, then that can be quite difficult, and it's not easy to go through that on multiple occasions. You do hear people go through loads of cycles. I've heard of 10 cycles and so on. So it is difficult. It's the sort of thing, I suppose, when you're younger, you worry more about not getting pregnant too soon rather than getting pregnant. And I suppose the assumption is, when you want to conceive, that it will be straightforward. And I think when that doesn't happen, that's obviously very upsetting. And yeah, so I think it's something that's becoming more common, infertility, because everything's so expensive. People often want to try and have a house and a job and things that are stable before they try and conceive. But obviously, as you get older, the chances of infertility also increase. So it's a difficult one. As a society, we're sort of waiting longer before we try to conceive, but obviously that can increase the chance of having infertility.
Can I ask, with the cycles, why is the norm to have 3 cycles? Why isn't just 1 cycle enough? Why do you need to have more than 1 cycle?
Yeah, you don't need to have more than 1 cycle. It's just that the first cycle might not be successful. So if you're successful after your first cycle, then obviously it's up to you whether you keep trying if you want to have more children. So that's, I suppose, the other thing is, usually the funding is only geared up to having 1 child. So a lot of people might want to have multiple children, and then the subsequent cycles won't be covered by the NHS. But yeah, it's because the chance of success is about a third. You might need to have multiple cycles to have a decent chance of success. But if you get, it's a third, so a third of people are successful on their first cycle, and then you don't need to have more cycles unless you choose to.
And are Black women more likely to be unsuccessful in their, or women of ethnic minorities to be more unsuccessful in their first cycles in comparison to their counterparts? Are they prone to have more cycles?
It
Just
does seem
really interesting.
Yeah, it does seem to be that way. So we're doing some research at the moment. So part of my work is around sort of IVF treatment, and we use some large databases. And one of the things that we're interested in is, like you say, what factors influence how likely you are to be successful. And there is some data already around ethnicity, and it does seem to be that if you're from Black ethnicity background, you do seem to have a worse likelihood of getting pregnant on your first cycle. So, in comparison to white women, it seemed to be that the chance of having a live birth was sort of reduced down to about a third of your sort of counterparts. So that's obviously a huge decrease. It's not 100% clear exactly why that is. So there was obviously a lot of factors involved in terms of the age of the women was slightly different and BMI was slightly different, so the body weight and things like that. So there's other factors involved. But it's something that we're looking to study a bit more deeply to try and figure out which bit of the IVF process might be different in these women so that we can try and focus on it a little bit more, try and resolve what the issue is and try and obviously help with that problem. Yeah.
So just to jump off of that, what systematic or practical obstacles do you see that are disproportionately affecting Black women when it comes to low-income patients in accessing endocrine or fertility care? And how might clinicians and the healthcare systems work to overcome these disparities, unfortunately?
Yeah, so I think that we mentioned already about sort of being able to afford fertility care. So obviously, if people are from, like you say, certain backgrounds where they have less funds, then that's going to be an issue, and that's going to worsen the inequity. So, for example, I also look after women with another condition called a prolactinoma, and that can stop people getting pregnant. But the treatment for that is just a tablet, and it's not very expensive. And so we can prescribe that very easily to anybody. And if they have a child and they want to go back on the tablet afterwards to have another child, it's not a problem. So I think the big problem with IVF is the cost of the procedure. That's why they have to start rationing it out. And then they start, adding on extra criteria. They're not necessarily biological, as it were. So, for example, if somebody's with a new partner and they have a child, sometimes that can influence whether you're eligible for care and things like that. So, there's all sorts of other factors because they're trying to sort of ration it to a certain extent. But it's not like that in every country. So, in a lot of Scandinavian countries, you can have as many cycles as you wish. So, and it's an interesting how we sort of view fertility as a sort of nice to have rather than as a essential, like if it was cancer care or something like that. But in terms of the impact it has on people's lives, it's very comparable to a lot of other diseases. So it causes obviously huge amounts of stress. A lot of couples, puts a lot of stress on their relationships. And things like, and lots of breakups and depression, anxiety, all of these things are much increased by infertility. So, it's an interesting one in terms of how we view it and how we value it. And it's difficult to make the argument that it shouldn't be, as many as you want. Obviously, it's the cost that's the problem, and that if you do say have as many cycles as you want, that cost has to come from somewhere else that's, obviously equally valuable sometimes, whatever the other conditions are that you then have to treat as well. So it's not easy. It's not an easy situation, but it's not ideal how we currently have the system either. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's difficult.
So when there's really amazing advancements in research, such as the Kisspeptin research that you do, how do you ensure these advancements benefit not only well-resourced clinics, but also patients who are maybe perhaps um, underserved or in marginalized settings? How do we make sure that they also get access to these incredible new treatments that are out there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think we do in research generally, we do have these sort of concepts of, so you might start off researching Kisspeptin. So I work at Imperial, which is a sort of tertiary centre. So you might start off doing your research there in very controlled settings, with a patient group that meets lots of criteria, and not have lots of other medical problems and be on lots of other medicines and things that can interfere with the research. So it's a sort of very, restricted group. But then after that, like you say, you want to be able to roll it out to a wider population. So that's called, generalizability in terms of how well does that research apply to everybody.
Mm.
And even when we do research trials, those initial studies to find out if it works is called efficacy. But then after that, to roll it out across the country and have it to a much broader population, that's called effectiveness. So you often do a much larger study after you've done your small study that shows this looks promising, to find out how well does it work, to people from all different backgrounds. And also, you want to make sure that, yes, you can do this at Imperial, but can you do it in, around the country? Can they deliver the same thing
Right.
everywhere? So that's called effectiveness studies. And often, it might be more powerful. It might, the size of the effect is often stronger when you're in a very controlled setting, and it might be a bit weaker later on. But that's a sort of more representative of how it's going to be used in the NHS. And I suppose that another key point from what you're saying is inclusiveness. So I do a lot of research with the NIHR, so they funded me for sort of many years to do research. And there's a huge focus on inclusiveness. So nowadays, when we submit our research applications, we need to have a very specific plan about how we make our research inclusive and generalizable. So if you don't include people from all different backgrounds, then the results aren't necessarily going to apply to them. So that's what's really important when we design studies. We need to make sure that we include everybody, as research participants, so that, they're represented in the results, and then the results are applicable to everybody who took part in those studies. Another thing that we do now in research is, it was really important that perhaps wasn't as important, well, not as important, but wasn't done as well many years ago, is called patient and public involvement. So so in the past, it was very much, the researchers would come up with a research plan and then run a study and then let patients know what the result was. So it would, they would just inform patients about the results. Whereas now we want to involve patients from the whole process from the beginning. So you have patients work with you when you design the study to make sure that it's designed correctly, to make sure you've thought about things like inclusiveness and how you make sure you reach people from different communities and different backgrounds and ensure that they have access to taking part in the study, how you make it easier for them to take part in the study. So they might have caring responsibilities. Can you, help with that, so that people are able to take part, and so that you are inclusive in your design. And so now we have, it's all about doing research with patients rather than to patients. So they're involved in the conduct and the design of the research, and also, in looking at the results and what we call dissemination, so telling people about the research as well. So hopefully that's going to make our research much better, much more generalizable, and obviously much more inclusive.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Exciting times. I really look forward to the day where, well, I think it's happening now, where patients have a say on the research that's being done, especially when it concerns them. So that's really exciting to hear that this is the approach that's now being taken. So
Yeah.
looking ahead, 5, 10 years time, so what emerging discoveries or technologies in neuroendocrinology are you most excited about?
So I think
That could,
probably one of
mhm.
the major. Can I comment on the last thing as well that you mentioned?
Yeah,
So, okay.
yes, of course.
So I think that another thing that you mentioned just there was about patients letting us know what research they want. So
Mm,
there's also another process called a priority setting partnership. So this is where patients and researchers get together, and over a sort of period of time, for each sort of topic area, they'll come up with the top 10 priorities that they want researched in a particular area. So that's called priority setting partnerships. There's something called the James Lind Alliance that does a lot of these. So they organize a lot of these, and you can look on their website and they have different conditions. And for each condition, you can see what are the top 10 research priorities. And that's really useful as researchers because we can then look at that resource, and then when we apply for funding, we can prioritize those questions that patients want answered. So that's an important advance as well. Okay. Shall I go on to the next question? What's it again?
yes, of
It's
course.
about the next 10 years. Okay.
Yeah, so in the next 10 years, what are the new technologies that are emerging?
Yeah. Well, I think obviously one of the major ones is artificial intelligence. So it's huge, and it's playing a big role in medical research in all of the fields really. So there's a huge explosion of research using artificial intelligence,
Yeah.
and I think obviously what it's able to do is it can handle complexity. So obviously we have, basic statistics already that can handle a certain degree of complexity, but some of these new artificial intelligence models are much better suited towards that. And so I think the likelihood is that this is going to help us personalize care. So rather than saying on average this treatment is good for most people, potentially we can say for this particular person with all of these characteristics, this treatment is going to be, the best for this person, and whereas this treatment will be the best for another person.
Mm,
So that's a huge area, and the technology is moving forward so fast. So I was hearing with each iteration of the model, the IQ of the model is increasing so fast. So I think it was, someone said it was like 160 already. So it's already very, very clever, but it's improving with each year. It's going up tenfold. So you can imagine in a few years' time, if it had an IQ or in the hundreds or something like
mm,
that, it's operating at a level that's beyond what we can currently comprehend. So it's exciting times, and I'm sure that's going to have a huge impact about how we do things. It can help take the burden off healthcare providers. So obviously, the
mm,
NHS is stretched, and if you can automatize a lot of things, that can mean that people have time to be doing other things instead and focusing their energies elsewhere. And also, it might well be able to do things that we can't currently understand because it's just going to be able to operate at such a high level. So I think
mm.
it's a potentially really exciting development.
And so, how can we design and implement these innovations so that they don't widen disparities, but instead enhance
Yeah.
care for diverse populations, which verify in levels of access and
Mm,
resources? You know?
yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, to a certain extent, some AI models are paid for. And so that can potentially, if some people, so I think I've heard people are using them for their applications and things like that. And you'd imagine most people have access. And so it might actually reduce disparity because most people have some sort of access to, a lot of them are free, for example, or at least the basic versions are free. But then you could argue that, you know, the more high tech versions are not free, and you know, do people have different access and therefore, you know, worsening equality? I suppose
Yeah.
another major issue is that a lot of these models learn on data. So if there are biases within that data, it will learn those biases. So it's, you know, that's obviously, it might then think that's the way it should work or something like that, as in rather than it's working like that because there are biases in the existing practice or in these existing data that it's learning on. So those are obviously things to watch out for. But equally, I suppose we need to make sure that the data it learns on is broad and generalizable and does include lots of factors so that it can, if there are genuine differences that it needs to learn about, then it's able to do so. Yeah, so I think those are probably the key things.
Amazing. Can you perhaps share a memorable lesson or patient interaction that shaped your perspective on the importance of equitable access in reproductive endocrinology, and how has that influenced your work today?
Oh, I'll have to think about that. 1 second.
Take your time.
Because
Because I always feel like when people go into these kind of fields, and I feel like your field's quite specialized, there must have been something that triggered that internally.
Yeah.
There would have been an interaction at some point with
Yeah.
you and another person, or several interactions that made you sort of take the leap and gear your career to this direction, because it's quite specialized. So was there a specific moment or memorable lesson or a patient? There must have been something that made you want to specialize in this field in specifics, because it's not easy.
No, not at all. So I think I've definitely met patients where you think, yes, you know, the research that we're working on could make a difference. So I think we've done some work, like I say, on Kisspeptin. One of the areas we think Kisspeptin could be helpful is within IVF treatment. And so IVF treatment, you basically stimulate the ovaries using lots of powerful hormones. And every now and then you can stimulate the ovaries too much, and you can have a condition called ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So it's usually, for most people, it's just symptoms. So they might get nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, but it can get worse than that. So they can start to get leakage of fluid into the abdomen, into the lungs. And, you know, very rarely they can even need intensive care and things like that. So one of the patients that we met on our study, she basically said that in her previous cycle, she'd unfortunately had really bad OHSS and needed to be on intensive care. And in fact, to the point where her husband was told that she wouldn't survive. Okay, so you know, luckily she had a baby. She did recover, but she was on intensive care for obviously quite a long time. She did want to conceive again, but because of that experience, obviously, you know, it was touch and go for a little while. She obviously didn't feel, her and her husband didn't feel that they would consider IVF treatment again. But when we were doing the research, and because of, you know, this idea that Kisspeptin could be much safer from that point of view, then she did volunteer for the research. So it was obviously an untested hypothesis at that point that we think it's going to be safer. But she had a sort of really much smoother experience. She's barely got any symptoms at all, and obviously was completely safe and conceived much more easily, you know, very easily, and without all of the complications that she'd had on her previous cycle. So that I thought was a really powerful story. And, you know, when she became a real advocate for the research. So she would help us with, you know, telling people about the research, and when we're applying for further funding and things like that, she would, you know, be a co-applicant and you know, advocate on behalf of the research. So those sort of things obviously have a huge impact on you. as clinicians.
That's amazing. So just to clarify, the general public can be co-applicants with the researchers for funding for specific research. I remember
Yeah.
you saying that they could, right. So do you want to just expand on that just a little bit,
Yeah,
just in case
so it's
somebody
very
wants
much
to?
so like I say, the patient public involvement, it's called PPI,
Yeah, you
is
did
now a
say.
sort of mandatory thing. So particularly when you apply to the NIHR, so the National Institute for Health and Social Care Research, so they fund a lot of the clinical research in the UK and in the NHS. So it's mandatory now to have PPI right the way through your research application and your design and prioritization. So which research you should do and how you should do it. And patients are often on a steering committee, but they can take a leading role with you and actually work together throughout the whole research. So it's not easy because obviously people have day jobs and they might have only a certain amount of time to commit. But if they have the capacity and they were passionate, so she was very passionate about this area, obviously given her previous experiences, and then there is that provision to be able to be a co-applicant on the research proposals.
Wow, amazing. Fantastic. I'll make sure to link to find that piece of information and link it on our bio so that people can go and do the research themselves. And if they want to apply, maybe they could.
Yeah.
So for early careers clinicians or researchers committed to addressing inequalities in fertility care, what personal qualities or interdisciplinary skills or strategies would you recommend they cultivate to drive meaningful change in endocrine research in its application?
So, yeah, I think they have to be interested, open and honest, and also, caring enough to find out if there are inequalities in care and actually focus, their research to see if there are inequalities. You have to have enough emotional intelligence as well to be able to sensitively discuss some of these issues that obviously can be quite touchy. You don't want to inadvertently cause any offense to anybody. And I think that comes from sort of engendering trust over a period of time, making it clear that your motives are positive and you're trying to help rather, than anything else. So I think, yeah, you can try and form trust working with people, showing that you have good intentions, and then obviously being interested to try and make sure that you do help people that are underserved.
Amazing. And then what advice would you give to not just, well, I guess these are two separate questions, but the first question is, if you are from an underserved community and you don't necessarily have the financial backing to go and have the IVF treatment privately, what advice would you give to somebody who wants to conceive and can't conceive naturally and want to take the IVF route? Firstly, and then for everybody else who might not have the financial backing, but might not be from, I don't know, from social, economic, or lower background or an ethnic minority who also want to take the IVF treatment, what advice would you give them moving forward? What can they do to make that process better and easier? Sorry, I know it's quite a heavy loaded question,
No, yeah, no,
but I feel like
absolutely.
people would want to know.
So yeah, I mean, so I think we should probably think about fertility much earlier than we do, and I think there is a lot of work going on about education in schools and planning fertility. Sort of it's very difficult when obviously life gets in the way and jobs and careers, and it's now so difficult to buy a house and things like that. So everything gets delayed. But I think planning early, also knowing when to seek attention. So infertility is sort of not being able to conceive after about a year of trying. So sometimes people wait for much longer before they actually get IVF care. And obviously if you go at younger ages and sooner, then the chances of success are better. So actually seeking attention when you have a problem. if you have, certain problems, you don't even need to wait a year. So if you're not having periods, there's no point waiting a year because you're very unlikely to be getting, pregnant spontaneously. So then you can seek attention even sooner. Yeah. So I think, seeing your doctor sooner, I think being aware of, what should happen as well. So you don't want to see your doctor after a year and they say something like you should go and try and conceive for a year. So you want to know what's supposed to happen to a certain
Right.
extent. So at that point, if you've been trying for a year, you can get referred to a specialist service and start having tests to find out what is the reason. So usually they'll test the male partner's sperm, they'll test the tubes, make sure they're not blocked, test if you're ovulating regularly. So usually if people have regular periods, they're usually ovulating regularly, those kind of things. But you can start to have those tests in the meantime. So a year doesn't mean that you can't get pregnant after. Obviously, you can still get pregnant, so you can carry on trying. But it's reasonable at that stage to start to have some tests and consideration of treatment as well. Um, yeah, so like I say, in most places there is access on the NHS to at least one cycle in most places around the country now. So it is getting better. It was worse a few years ago. And there are more places now that offer 3 cycles than used to be. So there is do seek attention from your doctor, and knowing that you can and you should seek attention as soon as you sort of reach those thresholds.
Amazing. Dr. Ali, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really grateful, really appreciative. Please carry on doing the research that you're doing. It's needed. I'm speaking as somebody from an underserved community. These researchers are needed, and it's been amazing to have you. Any last thoughts?
No, thank you so much for having me. And hopefully we can carry on making things better.
Amazing. Thank you so much.